So I was kind of keeping up with some of the controversy about this new game coming out, Lollipop Chainsaw. Looks like basically an American version of Onechanbara, basically hot chick fights monsters, over the top, intentionally silly sexual, not, something you're actually going to be like, wow, that's hot, but, just kind of being silly. How the girl got kicked out from, I think, PAX East for wearing too revealing of a costume. Maybe it's because she was, I guess, considered a booth babe or whatever, but the reason they gave was because they wanted to keep their convention family friendly. Which is fine, it's your convention, do whatever hell you want. I just think it's funny that a comic that has a character called a fruit fucker, and had, strips about one of the main characters doing entire portraits in his own semen and making giant dick cookies as an annual event, wants to keep things family friendly. But thinking about that game and the whole, I guess, horror games, and specifically survival horror, is this pretty much a dead genre now? Was there ever really enough of a push to make it a real genre? It's just something that Resident Evil had such a huge impact. Horror games really didn't take long for them to pop up at all. If you go back to, I think, Texas Chainsaw Massacre on one of the early Ataris, Nightmare on the NES was more of an action game, but Friday the 13th, I'd say, counts as a solid survival horror, game. Not quality-wise, but as far as the, I guess, genre touch points, it fits the mold. But really, I guess the genre really got its foothold with the 1-2 punch of Biohazard, Resident Evil, and House of the Dead. I know House of the Dead was a rail shooter and stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and count it because it helped influence the, I guess, game climate. There was a focus on horror and zombies and monsters at that point. That definitely came a little bit from House of the Dead. But after Resident Evil came out, it seems like you couldn't go 2 weeks without some sort of new somebody trying to glom onto that and make their own survival horror game, to make something scary, to try and build on that success. I remember Dino Crisis was okay. Eternal Darkness was actually pretty cool. My favorite, I guess, survival horror game was actually a Dreamcast title called Illbleed. And it's fairly obscure. It didn't really sell well. It didn't really fit a lot of other categories. But I liked it because it really did fit the nomenclature of survival horror. The whole idea of the game is your character had to survive horrors. You were walking through a horror-themed amusement park, and there was obviously the possibility of monsters, killing you bleeding out and such, but you could actually be scared to death. The game kept track of things, above and beyond just your health. It kept track of your heart rate. If it got too high, you could have a heart attack. If your adrenaline level, attracted adrenaline, if your adrenaline level got too low, you would pass out, and the monsters would get you or whatever. Each stage, essentially, it played out like either scenes from or sequels to something tied into these kind of fake B horror movies that existed only within the game universe. All of the stages, the traps and the stages and the monsters and all that sort of stuff, they were all thematically tied to these fake movies. It was really kind of cool. And there were some neat mechanics. See, how the game worked, it wasn't just that the monsters could kill you, but there were things that would occur, kind of those jump scares, the boo scares that you have in movies and stuff. They tried to implement these in the game. If you weren't paying attention, you'd walk through a particular area, and something would jump out. Whether, you walk past and maybe a shower would turn on and start raining blood or what have you. There's actually, in my office, when you walk from the shop to the office area, a large sign hanging up, and I look at it every time I walk past, because in one of the early stages of Illbleed, if you walk under this archway and there's a sign, if you don't check it, the sign will fall down and actually cut you. And I check it every time I walk through it. And you can actually use some sort of horror meter, these special goggles or what have you, to investigate certain things you think might be a trap. If you're right, you're fine. If you're investigating too much, your adrenaline level will drop because you're just not excited. You're checking everything. You're going so slow. Really neat mechanic. I like it. The biggest problem with that, though, was in the execution. The idea was great. It was a really cool concept. But maybe because of the limitations of the hardware at the time, before each of the actual scares, if you didn't try and go in and disarm them, there was a split-second kind of hesitation as the game would load, whatever that trap was supposed to do. So you always knew something was coming. You never really got that jump scare. And that it took away from it, though. All in all, the game was pretty cool. It was one of those creative games that you got only on the Dreamcast, even more than like the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, which had a lot of really fun experimental titles. I don't see anybody really focusing on a game like Vib Ribbon. But the Dreamcast had... the Power Stone games were, I think, far better party fighting games than the Smash Brothers series has ever been. Choo Choo Rocket is a great kind of action puzzle game. I guess it fits under the party mold, same as Bomberman. It's a fantastic multiplayer. Seaman was just weird. At the time, I kind of wondered if you were able to teach him to speak, could he then talk back and maybe teach a Furby to talk? Furbies didn't last long. Thank God for that. Those things were just fucking weird. Today, though, you don't hear as much about survival horror as a thing. You still have games coming out. You still have new Resident Evil games every now and again. You have things like Dead Rising, Dead Space, Dead Island, and kind of lame naming conventions here. You might even count Biohazard, not Biohazard, shit, what's it? BioShock as a horror FPS. And I might lump that in there. But it's as a whole, the genre's kind of fallen out of favor. It's not what it once was. Right now, console-wise, at least in the US, I would say the FPS is king. That's where you're getting your big bucks over and over and over. Those are your huge titles. I guess kind of third-person action games like Assassin's Creed do well. Western RPGs, Skyrim, stuff like that, seems to do really well. There's been a recent resurgence of the fighting genre ever since the success of Street Fighter 4. But even that's a fairly closed community. It's not really a huge industry-wide thing. Everybody's just trying to capture that almost nostalgic thrill of fighting games. I don't keep up with the sales figures. I can't guarantee any of this is accurate. I just look at the information that I see from my friends and what they're playing, what they're buying, what they're excited for. And nobody says, man, I can't wait for the new Resident Evil. I don't know anybody who's even talking about Resident Evil 6. Oh well. I always thought of the original Xbox as a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast. They were both Windows machines. The controllers were very similar. Both had the 4 controller ports. And they had a fairly similar library. There were a lot of games that got ported from the Dreamcast over to the Xbox. Jet Set Radio, Sega GT, some early stuff. And I thought that was going to really carry over. I never really picked up some of the oddball stuff, but it was still pretty cool. When the 360 started to re-release some of the Dreamcast greatest hits, I was expecting a flood of new ports. I was expecting a lot of more stuff to come through, but it doesn't seem like they ever got past Sonic Adventure, Space Channel 5, Part 2, Crazy Taxi, and Sega Bass Fishing, which I'll admit is actually still a pretty fun game. We, in my apartment at college, my friends who lived with me didn't own the Dreamcast. It was my Dreamcast, but they still went out and bought the fishing controller just to play bass fishing with me. I think if Microsoft really wants to grab those old Sega fans, fuck it. If Microsoft wants to grab this one particular old Sega fan, I want them to port Choo Choo Rocket. I want them to maybe port Illbleed or update it. That'd be kind of cool to see a sequel that they talked about, never finished. A remix or a sequel to the Power Stone games. I'd buy all 3 of those. That'd be great. But back to the topic at hand, survival horror. Is anybody looking forward to these games anymore? Is Resident Evil simply hanging on because of its marquee value? Are people still really attached to that franchise? I don't know. Mario is a franchise that exists. Zelda is a franchise that's holding on. Tekken seems to somehow really keep going. I don't hear a lot about people saying, man, the new fucking Tekken's coming out. But, yeah, I think the only survival horror franchise which is held on is Resident Evil. The Dead Rising games, I don't know, they got mixed reviews, and that's it. If you guys think that there's still a pull for it, let me know what your thoughts are on the genre. Any classic games from the past that you enjoyed. Or, I guess, on the second point, what Dreamcast titles would you like to see updated and brought across as a downloadable title, or even something released on a handheld, on the Vita or on the 3DS? There's a lot of room for those sorts of games there. The processing power can definitely handle a lot of older stuff.
Shit, I actually, as a postscript to what I was just talking about, I went inside the office and followed up with one of the guys there, and he pointed out the success of zombies in general currently. The Left 4 Dead games, it seems like you can't get a large title without some sort of zombie expansion. Maybe Red Dead Revolver or Redemption, whichever one it was. I think probably Grand Theft Auto may have had one. I know there have been a number of shooters that have had zombie add-ons. So maybe that's the big thing right now, that there is still a push for some sort of horror, but it's mainly zombies. Then you get in things, I know there's been a lot of attention paid to the Amnesia games, or is there 2 now? No, there's at least the first one, that people have said are really, really cool, will get you kind of frightened and stuff. I don't know if those count as survival horror. I don't know if they're just scary games. I don't even know, how do you fucking define what survival horror is? I guess the original definition was the horror theme, and rather than simple run and gun gameplay, you actually had to ration your bullets. You had to be careful. You had to... There's more focus, I guess, on Resident Evil had more focus on puzzles and shit. But, so I think maybe the slower pace, the less action, is what kind of made it survival as opposed to simply an action game with horror elements. So, it's not like there aren't horror games still coming out. It's just I don't know if they will fit into the survival horror genre titles or genre conventions. But it looks like I've made it out of the end of day parking lot traffic jam. So I should, I got my fucking high beams on now because hitting buttons and shit as I drive. So I should probably get off here. Again, if you have any comments about survival horror or horror games in general, if you have comments about the Dreamcast, its relationship with Microsoft and the Xbox, any games you'd like to see carried over to the new systems, please leave a comment below, put in a response video, do whatever the hell you gotta do. I should get off the camera before I cause an accident. Later.